Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1, Something Follows Me Home. It started, as most things do, with an ordinary day. The kind of day where the sun is just the right temperature, the air fresh but not too cold, and the world seems at peace with itself. I had been to the grocery store, the post office, and the usual errands that fill the hours of a Thursday afternoon. There was nothing strange about the day. It was by all accounts as mundane as any other. But as I walked back to my apartment, the feeling crept up on me. The slow, inevitable realization that something was different. Something was following me. It wasn't a sound at first, not a noise, just an odd sensation, as though I were being watched, though I didn't see anyone around me. The streets were quiet, the houses neatly aligned, their windows dark, the blinds drawn as they always were at this time of day. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, lurking just behind me, too close to ignore. I quickened my pace, trying to dismiss the thought. It's nothing, I told myself, shaking my head as I clutched the plastic bags in my hands. It's just nerves, that's all. But the feeling didn't fade. It grew, a steady weight pressing against the back of my neck, like a shadow that had taken on a life of its own, stretching in ways it shouldn't. By the time I reached the door of my apartment building, my hands were trembling. I set the bags down to fumble with my keys, half turned toward the street, half expecting to see someone there, someone following me. But there was no one. The street remained as empty as it had been the entire walk home. Only the soft whisper of the wind disturbed the silence. When I finally stepped into the building, the sensation didn't fade. It lingered like a presence, a quiet weight that settled on my shoulders and made every step feel heavier than the last. I tried to ignore it as I ascended the stairs, but the feeling kept growing. I could almost hear something behind me, though I dared not look back. It wasn't until I reached the door to my apartment that I felt it. The sharp, cold breath of air against my skin, the unmistakable sensation of someone standing just a hair's breadth away from me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway, stretching behind me like a tunnel, dark and silent. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, hidden in the shadows. That night I didn't sleep. I tried to convince myself that the events of the day had been nothing more than an overactive imagination, some fleeting anxiety that would pass in time. But the more I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the more I felt the weight of it. The something, the presence that seemed to follow me, not in the sense of footsteps or sounds, but in a deeper, more insidious way. It was as though it was embedded into the fabric of the walls themselves, as though it had been there for much longer than I had known. The clock ticked on, hours slipping away like sand through my fingers, and still the feeling remained. It was in the air, in the stillness of the room, in the corners of my vision. It was as if the shadows themselves were alive, crawling closer with each passing minute. I couldn't stay in the bed anymore. I got up, pacing the small confines of my apartment. My heart raced in my chest, the thumping a loud, frantic rhythm in my ears. I checked the locks on the door, the windows, every possible entry point, though I knew deep down that whatever was out there couldn't be kept out by mere locks and latches. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning, when the sun had just begun to rise, that I noticed it. A small, subtle change in the atmosphere. The air, which had been heavy all night, seemed to thicken, as though it had turned from oxygen to something denser, something I couldn't quite breathe in properly. And then I saw it, a shape, a dark form, standing in the doorway of my living room, just beyond the reach of the light from the hallway. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, the remnants of a sleepless night mixing with my overactive imagination. But no, this was real. The shape didn't move, but I could feel it there, its presence pressing in on me, like a weight I couldn't escape. I froze, my eyes fixed on the shadow, my body trembling with a fear I couldn't name. It was tall, slender, its edges jagged and indistinct, as though it were made of darkness itself, as though it were born from the very shadows of the room. I could make out no features, no eyes or mouth. It was simply a shape, an absence of light that had taken form. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. My heart was a deafening drum in my chest as I waited for it to move, to approach me, to reveal its purpose. But it didn't. It simply stood there, watching, waiting. Eventually, my legs, stiff and unresponsive, moved on their own, carrying me backward toward the hallway, toward the door. I didn't know what I was running from, only that I had to get away. I had to leave. I grabbed my keys, bolting out of the apartment into the cool, early morning air. I ran without thinking, through the streets, away from the building, away from whatever had followed me home. The quiet town around me seemed untouched, unaware of the thing that had been lurking just behind me, just out of sight. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I didn't look back. I couldn't. My mind screamed at me to keep running, to leave everything behind, to escape whatever had attached itself to me. But as the sun slowly rose, casting a soft light across the empty street, I realized that I couldn't run forever. The thing that followed me home wasn't something I could escape. It had already found me. I didn't return to my apartment that day. I couldn't. The idea of walking through that door again, of crossing the threshold where the shadow had waited for me, was unbearable. I spent hours walking the streets, my thoughts scattered, frantic, and disjointed. The people I passed seemed normal enough, oblivious to the fact that someone was following me, that the world around me had subtly shifted in ways I couldn't explain. I thought about calling the police, telling them about the shadow, but something held me back. What would I say? How could I explain what had happened without sounding insane? Officer, there was a shape, a darkness in my living room. It didn't move, but I could feel it there, watching me. No, I couldn't. No one would believe me. The only thing that would come of it would be a trip to the psych ward, and that wasn't an option. So I kept walking. I kept running. The sun began to set, and I found myself standing by the small park at the edge of town, my legs aching from hours of aimless wandering. It was a peaceful spot, with trees that lined the walking path and a few scattered benches, the kind of place where people came to sit and think or to watch the children playing, laughing in the fading light. I sat down on one of the benches, my hands shaking as I rested them on my lap. The air was cooler now, the shadows longer, and the quiet of the park was almost oppressive. But as I sat there trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart, I felt it again. The presence, at first I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that the fear of the shadow was still lingering, poisoning my thoughts. But no matter how hard I tried to push it down, it wouldn't go away. That familiar weight on my chest, the feeling of eyes on my back, of something or someone watching me, waiting for me to slip up. I stood abruptly, my breath quickening. "I'm not crazy," I whispered to myself. the words coming out hoarse like a prayer. "I'm not crazy." I turned and walked away from the bench, back down the path. I needed to go home. I needed to face whatever was in my apartment. Running wouldn't solve anything. If I stayed away, it would only get worse. The thing following me would only grow stronger. But as I walked back toward the street, something caught my eye. A figure standing under one of the trees at the far end of the park, near the shadow of the path. For a moment I thought it was just a person, someone walking their dog, or maybe a jogger taking a break. But when I looked closer, I froze. It was too still. It wasn't moving, wasn't breathing, just standing there, a dark silhouette against the fading light. My heart thudded in my chest, the panic bubbling up in my throat like acid. It was too far away to see clearly, but I didn't need to see its face to know. It was watching me. And the worst part, I was sure that it knew I had seen it. My legs felt like they were made of stone as I slowly backed away, my eyes locked on the figure, my pulse a loud drum in my ears. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, as if it had always been there, waiting for me to notice. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My body was running on pure instinct now, the terror in my veins propelling me forward, past houses and trees and streets, until I finally made it back to my apartment building, gasping for breath. But even as I stepped into the building, I knew it was too late. The thing had followed me. It wasn't something that could be outrun or avoided. The air in the hallway felt thick, suffocating, as if something was waiting in the shadows, just beyond the dim light of the hallway. I bolted for the stairs, climbing them two at a time, my thoughts racing. I had to get inside. I had to lock the door and do whatever I could to make it stop. When I reached my floor, I fumbled for my keys, my hands slick with sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. I pushed open the door, stepped inside, and slammed it shut behind me. For a moment, the room felt safe. The world outside felt distant, as though it couldn't touch me here in the quiet of my apartment. I bolted the locks, leaned against the door, and closed my eyes, taking deep breaths. But then came the sound, a soft scrape as if someone, was gently running a finger along the edge of the door. A deliberate sound, one that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I slowly turned, my legs shaking beneath me, and looked into the living room. The space seemed off. The shadows in the corners were deeper than they should have been, and the air, once again, felt thick, like something was pressing in, suffocating the room. And then I saw it, the shadow from before, the thing that had been following me, was standing in the middle of my living room. It was no longer a vague shape, no longer just an absence of light. It had form now. I could see the outlines of it more clearly, though it still didn't resemble anything human. Its shape was tall, impossibly thin, with edges that blurred and shifted like smoke in the air. I couldn't tell where it began or ended. It was simply there. And as it loomed over me, I realized something. The thing in my living room, it wasn't waiting for me to run. It wasn't just watching anymore. It had found me. The door to the hallway creaked, and I heard it again, the scrape, this time from the opposite side of the room, as though it was moving toward me. I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, as though the very air around me was pressing me down into the floor. My mouth went dry, my breath shallow. The thing in front of me didn't move, but I could feel it. It was getting closer, and then I heard it, a whisper, barely audible, like a breath against my ear. "You can't escape." I don't know how long I stood there, my body frozen, unable to do anything but stare at the shifting darkness that had claimed my home. Time had lost all meaning. All I knew was that I couldn't stay here, couldn't let it close the distance any further. I had to do something. But what? What could I do against something that was not human, that existed in the shadows and bent the very fabric of the world to its will? I had no answers, only the overwhelming certainty that whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to leave until I was gone. Story 2, The Creeping Darkness. It began, like most things, with an unsettling quiet. The kind of quiet that seeps into your bones, leaving you restless and uncertain. The streets were empty. No children playing, no dogs barking, no cars rumbling by. Just a silence that settled over the neighborhood like a thick fog, choking the life out of the usual hum of the world. Charlotte hadn't noticed it at first. She had simply gone about her evening, just as she always did, with a cup of tea in hand and a book in her lap. The world outside her window was fading into twilight, the last rays of the sun casting long shadows across the pavement. But even as the sky turned dark, something felt wrong. The shadows didn't behave like they should. They stretched too long, bending at odd angles, as though they had their own will, their own purpose. It was only when she heard the first knock that the unease truly settled in. She had been sitting by the window, her book abandoned beside her, staring out into the stillness of the street when the sound came. A soft, almost imperceptible knock, the kind that could easily be mistaken for the wind tapping against the glass. But Charlotte knew better. Her heart skipped a beat. She tried to brush it off. It was probably just the house settling, she told herself. Or a neighbor, maybe. But when the knock came again, faster this time, more insistent, she couldn't ignore it any longer. Reluctantly, she stood from her chair, setting the cup down on the table. Her feet moved on their own, as if compelled by some unseen force. She walked toward the door, her hand shaking slightly as it reached for the handle. The house felt colder now, and the air in the hallway was thick, oppressive, as though it had been waiting for her, waiting for this exact moment. Charlotte opened the door slowly, her breath catching in her throat as she peered out into the darkness. Nothing. The porch was empty. The street was empty. The world outside seemed as still as it had been a moment ago. But there was something else. A feeling, an undeniable sense that something was watching her from the shadows just beyond the light of the porch. Her gaze flicked to the side, where the trees stood silent, their branches swaying ever so slightly in the breeze. There was nothing there, of course. Nothing visible, but Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, that something was out there, just out of sight, waiting. She closed the door quickly, the sound of the latch clicking shut echoing in the stillness. Her heart was pounding now, her breath shallow. She turned around, her eyes scanning the room, expecting to see the familiar walls of her home. But the room didn't look the same. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, darker. They stretched unnaturally, curling and creeping along the walls, as though the darkness itself was alive. Charlotte's mind raced, her thoughts tangled in a haze of confusion. Was she imagining things? Was the isolation of the night playing tricks on her? Or was there something more sinister at work? The knock came again, this time louder, more forceful. Her hand flew to her chest as a jolt of fear shot through her. She felt paralyzed, trapped in the grip of an unknown terror. The knocking had come from inside the house. Slowly, almost unwillingly, she turned to face the hallway. The door at the end of it stood ajar, the faintest sliver of darkness visible through the gap. The door to the basement. The basement was always locked. She never went down there, never needed to. It had been sealed off long ago when the house had been renovated, and Charlotte had no reason to open it again. But now the door stood open, the darkness beyond it stretching like a mouth, eager to swallow her whole. Her feet moved before her mind could fully catch up. She found herself walking toward the door, every step dragging her deeper into the unknown. The air around her grew colder with each passing second, and she could hear the faintest whisper, like the rustle of dry leaves coming from the basement. She reached for the door frame, her hand trembling as she pushed the door wider. The shadows inside the basement seemed to pulse, as though something was moving within them. It was hard to tell, hard to make sense of the shapes that twisted and writhed in the dark. But there was one thing Charlotte was certain of. It wasn't the usual shadows of dust and forgotten things that lingered in that cold, damp room. This was something else, something that didn't belong. And then she saw it. At first, it was nothing more than a flicker, just a brief shift in the darkness. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw it more clearly. A figure, tall and thin, standing at the far corner of the room. It was made of shadow, but it wasn't like any shadow she had ever seen. It seemed to absorb the light around it, twisting and stretching unnaturally, as though it were born from the very darkness itself. Charlotte froze, her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The mere presence of it filled the room with an undeniable sense of dread. And then the whispers came. At first, they were soft, barely audible, a low murmur that seemed to come from all around her. But as the seconds stretched on, the whispers grew louder, clearer. They were voices, overlapping and indistinct, as if 100 people were speaking at once, their words impossible to decipher. The darkness in the basement seemed to expand, creeping out from the corners of the room, crawling along the walls, inching toward her. The shadows had become a living thing, hungry and desperate, as though it had been waiting for her too. Waiting for her to open the door, to let it in. Charlotte stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to retreat. Her eyes were locked on the figure in the corner, unable to look away from the terrible sight. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, drowning out her thoughts. She could feel the coldness in the room creeping into her bones, sinking into her very skin. The thing in the basement didn't move, but Charlotte could feel its presence growing stronger, like a pressure building in the air around her. It was pushing her, forcing her to stay, to remain in its grasp. Her legs gave out from beneath her, and she sank to the floor, her hands clutching at the edge of the doorway as the darkness closed in around her. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The whispers faded, the shadows receded, the figure in the corner of the room vanished, leaving only the empty basement behind. The door slammed shut with a deafening thud, and Charlotte was left alone in the silence. But she knew deep in her gut that it wasn't over. The darkness hadn't gone anywhere. It was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the next moment, the next opening, to creep back into her life. The creeping darkness had found her, and it would never let her go. Charlotte sat frozen on the floor, her back pressed against the door, as if the solid wood could protect her from the encroaching horror. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, each one harder to take than the last. Her fingers dug into the cool wood of the door frame, desperate for something, anything, to ground her. The silence that followed was almost worse than the whispers. The absence of sound was suffocating, pressing in on her like a vice. It felt as though the house itself had stopped breathing, waiting for something. waiting for her to make the next move. She couldn't stay here. Her mind screamed for her to move, to run, to escape whatever had just happened, but her body refused to obey. Her limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as though the air around her had thickened and become a tangible force that weighed her down. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Charlotte pushed herself to her feet. Her knees buckled as she stood, and she had to grab the door frame for support. She could feel it then, the coldness in the air, the same coldness that had consumed the basement, now creeping into the rest of the house. It wrapped around her like a blanket of dread, its icy fingers brushing against her skin. The house felt wrong. She could no longer deny it. It had never felt like this before. It was as if the walls were closing in, suffocating her, each room now a prison, every hallway a trap. Without thinking, she hurried to the window. The night had deepened, the darkness outside now complete. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches casting long, twisted shadows across the lawn. But it wasn't the trees that held her gaze. It was the emptiness of the street, the stillness of it. Nothing moved. The streetlights flickered briefly, then went out entirely, leaving the world outside consumed by a thick blackness. The only thing that remained was the house, the room she was in, the feeling of something unseen pressing in from all sides. Charlotte turned away from the window, her pulse racing, and took a step back into the room. Her hands trembled as she reached for the light switch, her fingers brushing the edge before she yanked it down. The room plunged into darkness, except it wasn't completely dark. There, in the corner of the room, the shadows had begun to gather again. This time, they were more defined, more concentrated, as though the very air had thickened and turned into something that could be shaped and molded. And there, in the center of it, was that same thing, the presence that had watched her from the basement. It had taken shape once more, its form slowly coalescing in the corner, where the darkness was thickest. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat as she backed away. She didn't dare turn her eyes away from the corner, didn't dare blink, as if doing so would make the thing real. The air was so cold now that she could see her own breath, a white cloud in the oppressive dark. The figure moved. It didn't walk. It didn't need to. It simply shifted, as though the darkness itself had lifted and dragged the figure forward. The shadows moved in unison with it, twisting and contorting into shapes too strange to comprehend. Charlotte could feel its eyes, even though she couldn't see them. There was something about it, something that felt like it was burrowing into her very soul, searching for her. The whispers returned, but now they were not just voices. They were feelings, emotion, fear, despair. Each whisper was like a hand closing around her heart, squeezing it until she couldn't breathe. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice said, not with words, but with the weight of its meaning. Charlotte stumbled back further, her body moving on its own, not caring where she went, just needing to escape, to get away from the suffocating darkness that was pulling her deeper and deeper into itself. But as she reached for the door to the hall, she stopped. The hallway was darker than she remembered. The door, once a barrier, was now open wide, the shadows spilling out, filling the space like water over a drowning soul. And at the far end of the hall, just beyond the light of the room, was a silhouette. Not the same figure from the corner, but another. This one was smaller, hunched over, its shape unnatural, almost grotesque. Charlotte's body went cold. Her heart froze in her chest. She knew it. She didn't have to see it clearly to know. It was her. It was her, The thing in the hallway wasn't another shadow. It wasn't something new. It was her, the version of herself that had been swallowed by the darkness. Her skin was pale, her eyes hollow, and she stood there, silent, watching. But what filled Charlotte with the deepest terror wasn't the figure in the hallway. It was the thought that somewhere deep down she recognized it. The thing in the hallway was her. But it wasn't. It was a part of her that had been left behind. A part of her that had been consumed by the creeping darkness, that had slowly begun to unravel everything she knew, everything she was. A scream rose in Charlotte's throat, but it never escaped. The air was thick with something that choked off her voice, smothering it before it could break free. And then, as if the house itself had decided to claim her, the shadows closed in. Charlotte staggered backward, her legs shaking, her body refusing to move. Her back hit the wall, and she slid down it, her hands pressing against the cool, rough surface, as if it could offer her any protection from the terrifying thing she saw before her. The figure in the hallway, her doppelganger, her shadow, stepped forward. Her eyes locked onto Charlotte's. The emptiness in them seemed to expand, drawing in the light, pulling the very essence of Charlotte's soul toward them. "You can't escape," the voice whispered again. But this time it wasn't the thing's voice alone. It was 1,000 voices, all speaking in unison, all calling her name. "You were always meant to be here." The walls of the house began to shift. The darkness twisted, expanded, and began to bleed into everything. The house itself seemed to groan under the weight of it. And as the shadows finally overwhelmed her, Charlotte understood. The darkness had always been here. It had been waiting for her, for anyone it could claim. And now it had taken her. If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here, the darkness is always waiting, just for you.